The idea now is that poetry, we're going to be doing a little stint. This is for written poetry. I said I was going to do this out when I was going to do it properly. It's going to feel like a English lesson at first, but that's something to get used to. I wasn't never a fan of English. I never liked English. Thought it was a waste of a topic. Thought it was a waste of a subject. But at the same time, it does have its benefits because it makes everybody literate. And if everybody is literate, it's easier to communicate. And it's, although I don't usually enjoy the structure they confine you to, after you learn that structure, it's a lot easier to go outside that structure. I don't really support the fact that you should go all the way to grade 12 in an English-speaking country to learn English. I believe that all the things they teach us later on are basically redundant and repetitive, but that's also an opinion. But in this case, they taught there was a lot of things. We'll probably learn them in grade 9, grade 10 English, and I'm not sure what you would call them. You have literary devices, just like you have literary devices. You have poetic devices, and those poetic devices, for the most part, people use them and don't realize they're using them, or they do realize they're using them, but they're not as blatant to somebody who's actually reading the poetry. So what we're going to go over first before we get into any kind of poetry writing is what's actually going on inside of a poem. I'm not going to go over types of poems because that's also a repetitive thing, because in teaching someone how to write a poem, I'd have to teach you how to write every specific standardized poem, and I don't believe that's possible. So what I'm actually going to be showing you is how to put together something that is poetry, and then you're able to form your own ideas and form your own writing tools in that sense. Poetry, the real difference between poetry and any kind of other kind of writing is it's its impact. It's just the strength of even a single line of poetry can evoke so much emotions. What makes poetry as strong as it is, it's the fact that it can convey a great many things in one single line. You have you have all forms of art, and every artist has an arrogance about their art form, saying their art form is the best. I believe my art form is the best art form. I don't know. I support every art form, but this is the way I can express myself. So in a sense, it's the best to me in how expression is supposed to be. And without that belief in the art that you're doing, you cannot bring across anything. So if you're going to attempt to write poetry, you have to also have that arrogance. So that's a little tip before you start. It's not a matter of being arrogant that you are subjected to only your art form. It's a matter of an arrogance that you believe that what you're doing is the best form of expression that would come about for you, and you're not desensitized to other forms of literature or paintings or music or any of that kind of thing. You're just a matter of belief that your art form is the strongest form of expression for you. So remember that arrogance is something to believe in. It's the fact that you can put as much as you want into that poem without feeling like you have to restrict yourself, with feeling you have to restrict the understanding or restrict what may be perceived by someone else. You can put anything you want into it, and I believe that's the first step, the first hint before we get into the poetic devices. That's something to keep in mind, that once you use these devices to their maximum, that's what you're going to be able to convey. That belief, that I believe it's as much as I say arrogance, I believe it's a more of a confidence in what you're bringing across. So before we get started on that, just keep that in mind. Keep that as something that you focus on. The first two poetic devices, I have a list here, a short list. It's not really a long list. I believe there are a lot more, but I believe this list is very effective for what we're going to be going over and what we're going to be getting into. You could search Google and type in poetic devices, and you'll get many links. You'll get many links. But first, for my purposes, I only used this one site. I'll provide a link if possible while we do this video. So poetic devices. The first thing we're going to start off with is comparisons. You have and when you're comparing, everyone's going to remember this. You have a simile and you have a metaphor. A simile is simply a comparison using like or as. Like say it's saying although they tell you not to use like a lot in your when you speak, when you're writing, the word like or the word as, when you're comparing two things, is a very effective poetic device. It's a simple, it's basic, and you go. Sorry, I actually thought I had a simile off the top of my brain, but if you're comparing water and the taste of water, how well water tastes, there is no taste to water. There's no actual taste to water. But if you were supposed to say my my everyday waking up I'm fresh like water, people understand that concept because they understand water is refreshing. Water is something. But you say like water, my waking up. Think about how you usually wake up. You wake up grungy. You wake up in a very dirty state of mind. But if you say I'm fresh like water, that conveys a sense of it's not an accurate comparison, but it is still a comparison, and that gives off a picture, an image to the reader that that's what you want them to perceive. And once they perceive that, you can proceed from there. So that in itself is a basic simile, or something along the lines of clear as glass, clear as day, shot like Mike, dance like Mike. You know, the idea is you see those images, you're dancing like Michael Jackson, you're shooting like Michael Jordan. When you look at glass, it's clear. So that comparison using a simile is very is something that we should keep in mind. It's like I said, they are basic. These are the basic points here. Now we're going to get into metaphors. Although it's similar to a simile. Okay, similar to a simile. Anyways, sorry about that. I didn't mean to actually say that, but it came out anyways. But a metaphor, I don't believe the imagery for a metaphor is as strong as a simile, because with the simile, you're giving two distinct pictures, and you can put those pictures together. With a metaphor, it's more, it's one sentence. So the sentence, sometimes you might miss the actual metaphor, and that's what happens sometimes when people write. The actual metaphor isn't really apparent, because you go with something like the lines are right or clearer than water. If you go with the lines are right or clearer than water, that is a metaphor. That's a comparison between the lines you write and water. In essence, you're basically saying the lines I write are so see-through that there's nothing left to the imagination. When you look into a clear glass of water, you see right through and you see everything, right? So in that case, the imagery isn't as strong as say a simile, but it's still a comparison, and that comparison gives the reader a certain understanding of what you're trying to bring across. Um, you could say, when I speak, I'm colder than ice. Think about the imagery you get when you see ice, and you think about all the things you think about when you see ice. You don't just think about ice in a cup. You think about iceberg. You think about the polar caps. You think about when you see somebody freezing and all you see around them is ice and snow. You really, it brings out a certain imagery, and again, that's what a comparison does. The idea, it basically epitomizes the idea of poetry. Is that it's all about imagery. It's about all about whatever picture comes to your mind at that instant when you read those lines. That's what you're reading. It's not so much the words, you're reading the pictures that it brings to mind. And that's why poetry is so expressive. But that's what a metaphor is, and that's what a simile is. So let's move on to the next poetic device, and let's see what that is. Like I said, a lot of these will cross over into what you know as literary devices, but there is a certain freedom when you use these that you don't have with more literary works, because they are more, you're more confined to what you can say or can't say. But with a poem, it's based on who you are, and as we get further along into certain things, the poem you start to see how an author will direct their personality into the poetry, whereas in most forms of literature, it's a matter of a structure that you must follow, and these devices don't have that same kind of freedom. So keep that in mind. Metaphor, simile. Metaphor without like or as, simile, like or as, and that will get you far. Before I move on, I have to mention allegories. I was actually thinking about it as I was going along, and I was going to give it its own category, But I do realize that that's also a metaphor. It's also a comparison, but it's a spiritual reference or something an abstract reference, to say the least. It's not so much just only spiritual, but it's an abstract reference. So a person can use a metaphor comparing comparing themselves to God. Well, for all the Christians out there, that's blasphemous. But the idea is that you make that comparison, but it's that comparison shows you something. It shows you a strength of character. It also shows you a certain qualities about that poet that you can also carry out through your understanding of how they write. Because anybody with that godlike persona or idea of writing, you realize that their poems are going to be very. I don't want to say anything negative, so I won't say anything negative. Just anybody with that kind of a comparison is going to have a very inflated opinion of themselves. So the idea when you read the poetry is you see that you see that come out in the poetry. So that comparison alone will give you an idea of how to perceive what else is being written. So you compare someone to Moses parting the Red Sea, and it's the idea is Moses sacrificed his upbringing, his everything to become that figure in history of the person leading his people out of Israel. So if you, I mean, is people out of Egypt? Sorry for all those people who actually know their Bible, realize I made a mistake there. But you make that reference, and all the stories that are reference to that actual figure become part of the poem. So that's what a metaphor can actually do for you. So before I continue, I'd actually have to mention that. So an allegorical reference is actually a metaphor, and that metaphor will bring along a story with it that you can actually tell at the same time. It's the same thing that goes for an anecdote. As you can put an anecdote in usually when you write, you have anecdotes, but in poetry your allegory is your anecdote. So you reference to something abstract and then a short story, then the reader themselves now will have to research that short comparison and see what you're talking about, and then they get an idea of what that line means. So that again is another strength behind poetry. You're not only able to put anecdotes inside of a poem, but using allegory in the form of a metaphor will give you, I said form of a metaphor. Anyways, that's another weird thing. But anyways, the idea is the allegory itself becomes your anecdote and tells a story and gives you a better understanding of where that poet is actually coming from. So again, that's another little tidbit there to add in. So just before I forget that, just bunch that in with similes and metaphors, mostly with metaphors, but that's the basic idea when you speak about allegories. Moving along now, we have assonance and alliteration. Alliteration is the deliberate repetition of the consonant sound in a line or in the poem itself, and assonance is the deliberate repetition of the vowel sound. So assonance, repetition of the vowel sound, alliteration, repetition of the consonant sound. Honestly, I really don't know how to differentiate between a vowel sound and a and a consonant sound, because when you put them together, when you read anything, a vowel and a consonant are usually right behind each other. So it's up to you, the reader or the writer, to emphasize which one you're actually keying towards, because I'm going to give an example of both actually. An antelope is an animated animal. In that sense, the N sound in antelope and animated and animal is being repeated. The N sound is being repeated, and the A sound is also being repeated. So there you have assonance and alliteration at the same time. So that one is a simple one to really get. There isn't really anything complicated about that. As far as poetic devices go, that's not the most profound of them, and it's not the one that gives you the well. It can set a mood or a tone, and we'll get to what tone and moods are. It helps you set that mood or that tone. It's a playful thing to use in your poetry, but it doesn't add a lot of depth. It's a thing that keeps you on the surface. If you want to keep people entertained and keep them bubbling. I guess that's the idea, and the word bubbling itself, we get into something along those lines. That's another poetic device as well. But in the first form of assonance and alliteration, I'd put them in the category of repetition. Repetition itself is something that you can use to emphasize things, to bring out certain ideas and make it more apparent to the reader what you're trying to say. So they concentrate on that idea a lot more, emphasize things. It doesn't give you a kind of the kind of imagery that a comparison would, but it still emphasizes certain details. It might emphasize a word, and in this case, assonance and alliteration emphasizes the sound, and you're concentrating on that sound. Helps the progress of the poem or the poetry, and helps you understand the tempo or whatever it is that the author is trying to set. It allows you to understand that a little bit better. So assonance is a repetition of the vowel sound. Alliteration is a repetition of the consonant sound throughout the poem. And as I said, it's the word repetition comes up there, and just group it into that one category, that repetition. It's all repetition. Um, I guess if we want to get broader, you can repeat a word constantly and add that into the category and say repeating a word also adds an emphasis. Repeating a sound emphasizes certain details that the poet wants to bring across. So bear in mind when you're reading those keys are there. It's just that a poet isn't sitting beside you telling you, oh, that vowel sound is being repeated, pay attention. It's up to you now, the reader, to see that and pay attention to it. And if you see it, it's not, when you see that in a poem or any form of poetry, it's not done by accident. It's done on purpose for whatever reason that author decided to put that in. So again, repetition, and the two things that are in there are assonance and alliteration. Alliteration, the repetition of the consonant sound, and assonance, repetition of the vowel sound. So again, this is really starting to sound like a very boring English lesson, but there's no way to actually write until these things are apparent, and there's no way to actually understand a writing until these things are geared into the mind, and you're able to see them without the definitions or the English lesson actually. So let's move on to the next device. The next thing we're going to get into is hyperbole. And hyperbole is an exaggeration. Right? If you say something is as hard as a diamond, that's an exaggeration. I don't know many things that are as hard as a diamond, but usually when you make that comparison, that's a big exaggeration. But still, it gives you an imagery, and again, it goes back to metaphors and similes. It ties into that comparison. The exaggeration brings you out of that. If you look at a water bottle, and that water bottle is easy to crush, and you say, the way I hold that water bottle, I couldn't break it. It was hard as a diamond. It gives the reader an idea of how difficult it was, but that's an exaggeration. There's no way that water bottle was as hard as a diamond, no matter how difficult it was to break. It's still not as hard as a diamond. So I said that a lot, repetition there. The idea then is to try to understand what the reader is trying to bring across, and not get too carried away with the exaggeration and think the exaggeration is the truth. But again, that's hyperbole. It's very simple, very easy to understand, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. It's raining. The next thing we're gonna get into is onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia. A lot of people remember this one. A lot of people will remember this from English. I remember a lot of people laughing at this in English class. So pretty sure a lot of people out there, once you hear this word, you'll know it. It's a word representing the sound that it's trying to describe. So again, I used the word bubbling in a previous poetic device. But bubbling, you can picture something bubbling, and it's describing the word bubbling, or the word buzz, or the babbling brook, or honest to goodness, there's a lot of them, but not a lot of them come to mind at this present time. But bubbling, babbling, buzz, all those three words are an example of what onomatopoeia is, and that's again another one of those simple ones to comprehend. There's nothing to it. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, because really and truly, if you see those things in a poem, really you're just going to picture whatever the word is, and once you picture what the word is, it's easy to understand. Again, not one of those things with depth into it, but it gives you a key into how a writer writes, and it helps you to better able to understand what you're reading. So onomatopoeia, a sound, a word representing the sound that it's describing. Simple as that. Personification is giving human attributes to inanimate objects. So simple. This one is a lot simpler than I thought it was at first, because this is my third take trying to explain what personification is. Don't mind that. But it finally dawned on me a simple way to explain it. If you have a pen and you're writing and you say, my pen is bleeding ink onto the page. Pens don't bleed. Well, they do, but the reference is there's a very human thing about bleeding or anything living for that matter. It's not. I don't believe that you can limit it to human attributes. I believe it's giving life to inanimate objects. So bleeding. A pen is bleeding. Pens don't really bleed. They do, but the word bleed is not a thing an inanimate object can do. That's what humans do. We bleed. So the idea is you're not going to think about ink. You're going to think about blood, and once you're bleeding onto the page, you're putting your heart and soul into it. So that imagery then is a very powerful imagery, that the pen is bleeding out your soul, is bleeding out your, like, and when your blood is your life. If you lose your blood, you die. So if you lose your ink onto the page, there's a chance you're going to die, and if you die, that's all you have left to represent yourself, that writing. And so yeah, that's my example of personification. It took me a while to even come to that. I don't know why it took me that long. I don't even know why it took me so many takes, but that's personification. I'm going to leave that one alone for right now, because for some reason it's giving me a little trouble to explain. Even though I've used it many times, it's still giving me a bit of trouble to explain. But that's the strongest thing I can give you for personification: a pen bleeding onto a page. If you see a writer say that, that's what they intend. That's what they're trying to get across. They're personifying the pen as a life. It's part of that person. So yeah, keep that in mind. Personification, human attributes to inanimate objects. Now we're past that. Okay. Up next is paradox and oxymoron. An oxymoron and a paradox are both examples of contradictions. So an oxymoron is two words put together to form a contradiction. It's the tall midget. That's an oxymoron. The tall midget? Where'd you get that from? Who says that? Anyways, or the little giant. That's an oxymoron. That's easy to understand. That's one form of a contradiction. And like I said, oxymorons, just two words that put together that are exact opposites. So you're using the first word to contradict the second word. But there is it's not as strong as of an imagery as the comparisons would be, as other forms of comparison would be, but it still gives you a sense of, wow, it draws your attention. It makes you think. And again, when you see that in writing, when a poet writes, for the most part, that is a very intentional thing. So when you see that in a piece of writing, pay attention to it and see why they put it there and what comes before that line and what comes after. So in that sense, it's another thing to draw your attention to the page. But the other form of contradiction is a paradox. A paradox requires a little bit more writing, a little bit more of an elaboration to see the contradiction. It's a paradox in the form of science. Is a form of science example of a paradox is going back in time to talk to yourself, to tell yourself that you're going to go back in time. That's a paradox. Like, if you knew that you're going to do it, why did you do it? So it gets a little bit complicated and a bit convoluted when you get into a paradox, but it's still a contradiction. You tell yourself you're going back in time to tell yourself not to go back in time. That's a paradox. There's no way you can go back in time to tell yourself not to go back in time, because that timeline would never have existed. In other words, you still wouldn't have existed, so you would be caught in a loop, and you constantly be going back in time, telling yourself not to go back in time. Anyways, I'm not trying to explain a paradox, but that's a paradox. That's a paradox. So paradox is a contradiction, is a contradicting idea, and oxymoron is two words put together that contradict each other. So hopefully, although my paradox was a little bit was above my own head altogether, that's an example of what a paradox is, and that's an example of an oxymoron is. And we'll move along now because I was thinking a little bit too much, and I'm trying to keep this simple, very simple. Right now it's rhyme and rhythm. This is where a poet kind of starts to put their personality. This is where it stops being straightforward, a straightforward English lesson. It becomes your personality now. It's your sense of rhythm, your sense of timing, and rhythm is how when a poem is read aloud. It's how does that poet intend to bring that poem across. Some poets will write the music. You could call it a song, really and truly, it's a song. But you write the music, and they'll use the meter of the music to set their rhythm. But there are poets who set their own rhythm, and those are the ones that are a little bit more difficult to catch on to. But you can feel it, and you know what rhythm they're trying to set. Some poets are a little bit too melodical for my liking, and there is no rhythm to the poem that's distinct. But there is a rhythm there. It's just a very subtle one that's so soft that you don't pick up on it right away. But every poem has a rhythm, and every poem has a meter that they set it by. It's like a slow song or a fast song. Which one would you rather listen to? Which one would you rather read? And the reason why rhyme comes in is usually the rhythm is set by the rhyme. You don't always set the rhythm by the rhyme, because there are a lot of poems out there that don't rhyme, and poetry isn't meant to just rhyme, but we associate rhyming with poetry. So every time you hear a rhyme, you really set, that's where the rhythm of the poem that's what the rhythm of the poem is based off of. So I was walking the dog, and a log came along in a fog and made me start to jog. But I was thinking out loud, is this what I'm supposed to be doing? I'm just going to be sleeping in this bog. The idea is, no matter how long I made those lines, the word ba, the og sound, that's the rhyme. The og sound is the rhyme, dictated what the rhythm of those lines would be. So wherever those rhymes were, that's where that's the definition of what the rhythm is. And really and truly, if that was written, it wouldn't be written that way. It wouldn't be written with all. It most likely would not be written with all the og sounds at the end of the lines, because I free write, so I don't have any parameters that I have to write in. I have to keep my lines to a certain amount of length or a certain amount of what are they called? Sorry, syllables. I don't have to do that. So if you're reading my poetry, in a sense, wherever you find the rhyme, you can use those rhymes to dictate what the rhythm of the poem is supposed to be. So that's what rhyme does. We bring in diction here also, because it's a part of the personality. It's the word choices. Word choices can define a rhyme. Word choices can define the rhythm, and word choices are based on the person, their upbringing, who they are. It defines who the person is. Your vocabulary, even though a lot of poets are very, very literate people. Just don't misunderstand a poet when they use slang or they use terms that you find derogatory. They're very literate people for the most part. I don't speak for all poets, but I speak for the most part. When you see those in there, the diction or the word choice is what brings out character in the poem. It's as if you were reading I'm using a simile, right? It's as if you were using, when you're writing a book, each character, when they write the characters in, you could say, and John said. You can't do that in a poem so easily. So the word choice or the diction gives you an idea of what they're trying to say. So again, diction will go along with rhyme and rhythm. Diction will also go along with the next poetic device also, and diction itself is a poetic device. But I didn't really give it its own stage to be described on, because it flows into personality, and it flows with rhyme and rhythm. That when you see a person rhyme, don't concentrate so much on the fact that the word isn't spelled properly or spelled the way you think it is. Concentrate on the sound and why they made it sound that way or why they wrote it that way. Now we move on into the final thing, which is tone and mood, and that's very much based on the writer. And I'm gonna try and get through this before my battery dies, because I'm getting the flashing green light right now. So that's why I rushed rhyme and rhythm. Apologize for that. But Uh, Moving on to tone and mood, diction comes along here because the diction will also set the tone and mood. Vulgarity, the diction or word choice is, and you see a vulgar word choice, that sets a certain tone, that sets a certain mood, and that mood is what you're supposed. Okay, let's finish up the tone or mood idea that we're on, because you can see I'm on a different camera. The battery did end up dying on me, so let's finish this up properly here. Tone and mood. That's a very much the personality of the author, and if you vibe with that personality, it's gonna click with you. You're gonna understand where they're coming from. You're gonna understand what that author is trying to talk about. This is where they put their personality in. This is where you understand that person. Aside from the imagery and the comparisons and the exaggerations and the repetition, this is where you really understand who an author is, because they're going to set a tone and they're going to set a mood. And again, diction comes back into play, as I was saying, and their word choices and the way they bring those words across and their vocabulary will give you an idea of who that author is and what they're trying to do. And I'm telling you right now, again, for the most part, the word choices of an author, from the rhythm of the poem, the diction does play a factor into the tone and into the mood of what is being brought across. So that's all the poetic devices. Keep those in mind, because what we're going to do now, once we move on into poetry writing, I'm going to use those terminologies as I go along now, and as we get into the idea of writing poetry now, these will become apparent and they'll become very useful to you as we go along. Like I said, these are the basics. This is the ground. This is building from the ground up, and I try to keep it as simple as possible, and it might sound very boring and very drawn out, but that's what it is. That's the first part. It's not supposed to be entertaining, it's not supposed to be interesting, but these are the building blocks, and these are how you are better able to understand what's actually going on. And I do wish that more people are drawn to this genre and get an idea of what is actually being brought across.